Next slide, please, Hannah. So in a wider context, as you can see on here, we share all the event information with our members, and on social media. And that could be our own webinars like today's, or the wider program of events that are put on by our other partners in the project. We're looking at developing pathways for community energy groups to grow and to sort of get that first step on the first rung of the ladder. We're looking to increase the shared learning and networking opportunities, and webinars are obviously just a small part of that. There will be other opportunities coming along soon. We're also very keen to let other people know outside of communities who are already very aware that community energy is a possible solution, and why it works, and what the extended values of community energy actually are, and where they can see those for themselves. Local authorities and climate change groups, as you will be aware, have already got their own remits to work on community energy to help support. So as I said before, we're planning to align ourselves and get us all aligned so that we're actually providing as much comprehensive support as possible. Some of you may have signed up for the peer mentoring services, and I think that's going to start next month. So good luck to all those of you who have signed up with that. I think you'll find that very valuable. And the next slide, Hannah. So, yep, I think Hannah will give you an update if we've got time at the end as well. But just some notes in your diary. You'll get these slides, like I said, so you'll have a chance to have a look at these again. But there's a shared ownership webinar is the next one that we'll do next month on the 19th. So keep your eyes open for that to sign up. There's a link there on the slide. You can also find other resources on our website, including a list of webinars that you might find useful. And the links are also on that slide. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to pass you over now to my colleague, Tom Noble, who will give you the practical overview of carbon audits.
Great, thank you, Kath. Morning, everyone. My name's Tom Noble. I'm a technical officer at Community Energy Scotland. And part of my work over the last kind of 5 or 6 months has been doing carbon auditing for the Carbon Neutral Islands project. That's for 11 further islands. So I'm just going to take you through the process of an energy and transport carbon audit, and give you a few examples at the end. Next slide, please, Hannah. So main structure of it is I'll give you an intro, just as a background of what carbon auditing is and the process of it. And I'll then go into a bit more detail about how data is collected, how you define the scope of where you collect data from, how you calculate the emissions, and then what you're looking for in reporting and analysis. Okay, next slide, Hannah. So if we look at the broad scope, what a carbon audit is trying to achieve is to give you an idea of the total greenhouse gas emissions produced. Now, it depends on what kind of carbon audit you're doing. For the audits I've been doing most recently for islands, that is therefore a geographic boundary. So that's just defined by the coastline. But carbon audits can be done for an individual, for example, for a carbon footprint, or for organizations or specific projects. What you're doing in a carbon audit is normally you're concentrating on the 3 main greenhouse gases, these being carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And using emission factors, you combine, you basically find the emissions out in a carbon dioxide equivalent. Why you're doing this is so that you have a easy measurement, and a comparison between the different types of greenhouse gases. So you get one equivalent output. Next slide, please. So the main process involved in the audit is first defining the scope of your audit, what you're covering. Is it a geographic boundary? Is it an organization? You then go on to collect all the data for the carbon audit. And this can be from multiple organizations, local councils, local surveys. Um, you then go on to apply the calculations, which are relatively simple normally, um, reporting analysis. And then one of the very important stages is checking your data and making sure it lines up, first off, just with a basic sense check myself, and then with other organizations or other people. Next slide, Hannah, please. So in terms of defining the scope, in the cases that I was doing, this was for Ireland, so it was a island coastline boundary. Once you've defined the scope of your carbon audit, you then need to apply a methodology to this. Now, the most common methodology used for carbon audits is greenhouse gas protocol. In this case, a specific one for communities and cities. So that essentially you're using a standardized process which allows comparison between different carbon audits, and it allows it's kind of a reassurance that the carbon audit is being completed in a way which is a standardized process. So it will be the same. In terms of scoping, if we go a bit deeper, when you do a carbon audit, you have to there's several scopes. There's scope 1, 2, and 3. And if we go into the next slide, Hannah, I'll explain in more detail what these are. So what you have is you have direct emissions, and these are emissions that are attributed directly to the place that is being audited. So in this case, in an island, that is emissions which are directly created on the island. And that is your scope 1 emissions. So in our case, for energy and transport, you mainly got stationary energy from residential and commercial businesses. And you've also got transportation from on-road vehicles, off-road vehicles, community buses, things like that. Now, for scope 2, this largely entails the electricity that is supplied to an island. So it's electricity supplied to anything which is using the electricity. For scope 3, you then have two main things. If you have transportation which is leaving the island, for example, ferries or aviation, this would come under scope 3. You also would have to consider, though this gets a bit more complicated in this case, if you have, say, a bus service which is starting on an island, crossing onto mainland and continuing, there's a case of having to attribute which part goes to direct and which is indirect. Now, the key here is that scopes is just a way of kind of putting emissions into sectors to make sure that you're not attributing emissions to the wrong place. So you're only attributing emissions directly from the island to scope 1. And it really, what it does is it helps to prioritize where action can be taken and where emissions that you're actively creating and where you can have an impact on them. And next slide, Hannah, please. So just to go a little bit into the areas that are collected for an energy and transport audit, you've got the main categories you can see there. These mainly being the residential and commercial buildings and some with the agriculture sector. Manufacturing industries tend to be less for the ones I've been doing. For activity data, you've got on-road vehicles, ferries, which tend to be quite a significant factor in these audits, and aviation and off-road. And these all, within the greenhouse gas protocol, you have um, outlined different methodologies that you can apply to gather data and to calculate the emissions and to put them into the right scopes. Next slide, please, Hannah. So to give you an idea of the types of sources I've been using when collecting data, ideally you want as local data as possible because that gives you the most accurate idea of the emissions that are being produced. So household surveys, local knowledge about community transport, for example, is very useful. For transport, the ideal scenario is to get fuel use records from the ferry services or from aviation services. If that's not possible, um, I tended to have to go for backups, for example, looking at timetables, looking at aircraft types and the fuel used for a certain journey distance and going from there. Um, so what you can see here is I've kind of ranked it in order of accuracy, really. Um, Regional data is still it's good data to use. It's normally from local government. However, it is scaled data, so there is an element of it being slightly less accurate. So the ideal scenario is local data. But in some circumstances, the only data available is at the national data set level. So it's a case of how to scale that down. Next slide, Hannah. So in terms of emissions calculations, the actual calculation is quite simple. You have activity data, which could be the number of miles driven by a car or the number of nautical miles that a ferry has traveled. And what you do is you then apply an emission factor to that, and the output you get is the tons equivalent of CO2 emitted. So I've given a bit of an example calculation at the bottom. If you had electricity, you basically just multiply them together and you get your kilograms or tons of CO2 output. Now, most of the emissions factors that I've been using and that you commonly use are from national data sets. If there's not the emissions factor available on the national data set, then you can try and look at the international data sets like the IPCC database. However, it's very much encouraged to go with national data sets where possible, just because it's a higher accuracy emission factor because it's more localized. Yeah, next slide, please, Hannah. So in terms of the reporting analysis, what you're the main idea for the output is to give an idea on a sector and subsector basis of the emissions produced. This is basically so that if communities or organizations want to find where emissions are coming from and where they can have the most impact, then this is kind of the most important thing. So this is an example from the carbon audits I've been producing for the current islands. This is just a main summary. So the expectation is you'd have something like this, and then you'd go deeper into each subsector and look at, for example, on the on-road sector, what are the specific vehicle types which might be producing more of the emissions. Now, there is one, I think, part that is worth mentioning that there has to be a bit of care taken in terms of the level of detail you go to, in terms of making sure you're not highlighting specific emitters that could cause conflicts. But that's the general idea for what you're looking for when you're reporting. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is actually one of the kind of most important parts of the carbon audit, which I've had to be exploring in the last couple of months. When you do your initial calculations based on the data you've gathered, it's not unlikely that you'll come across um, areas which might not kind of they'll just look maybe quite different to what you're expecting. And the idea behind those areas is they're not necessarily wrong, but the way that I've treated them is that it's a way of highlighting something that you need to check over and make sure that based on your initial sense check that there's nothing being kind of done incorrectly in your calculations. Um, Now, if I recheck and I think they're okay, my secondary option is then to go to the community directly that I'm involved with and ask them to sense check the data. Um, that gives me an extra kind of level of security that what I have got as an output will be representative. Um, and other options as well is just getting second opinions from uh, other people in CES and in my organization that might have knowledge on this. But the idea behind sense checking um, is just to make sure that the data that I'm providing in the carbon audits is as accurate as I can possibly make it. Next slide, please, Hannah. So I'm just going to go through a brief example. This is one of the islands I've been doing recently, North Ronaldsay. So yeah, simply for the boundary, you've got the coastal boundary. Next slide. This is just a highlight of the kinds of data I was collecting for North Ronaldsay. So I'll just go next slide. I can explain in more detail. So first example here, if we're going for residential buildings, where we started was we looked at home analytics data set. And what this gives us is it gives us an idea of the area of each house, and we can then use a benchmarking tool which gives you standardized fuel use factors for different household types. So what there's basically two kind of standardized fuel usages, and obviously for the kinds of areas we were working with, being more rural on an island, then there was options of a kind of more generalized emissions, but then there was an option for slightly higher emissions, maybe with houses with less insulation. So we kind of opted for the higher emissions area just to be because I think it was more representative of the types of houses we were looking at. In terms of the process I follow, we initially have a number of houses that were given on a home analytics data set. I then cross-check this with the number of households included in the census, and that's also cross-checked with household occupancy data from the Scottish Government. This is just basically to make sure that the data set I have is not overrepresenting how many households are there, and making sure I'm on the right lines. So once you've applied your fuel use factors to the different households, you then get an output of the splits of fuel usages for in specific types, these being solid fuel, heating oil, biomass, and LPG. In terms of this, the only thing to highlight here is at every it's quite frequent to have to make assumptions. So for example, for solid fuel, I have to make an assumption about in general what solid fuel is being used. And also for biomass, I had to make an assumption about what particular biomass is being used. I think wood was used in this case. But the reason for doing this is that a restriction you quite often encounter is the um, the emissions factors are only available for certain fuel types, and so you end up having to slightly make some assumptions in order to then be able to apply the correct emissions factors. Okay, next slide, please, Hannah. Okay, I'll just quickly go over this because I'm aware of time. So just to give you an example of what needs to be done for ferries looking at the Orkney Islands. In this case, we were provided with overall yearly fuel usage for a number of vessels. However, the challenge here is that the vessels are used for multiple islands and the vessels are switched, so you never know quite which vessel is going where. So in this case, we had to combine fuel data with timetables to work out exactly how much portion of fuel was being used for individual legs of each island, and that's what's then fed in to the audits. Yeah, okay, I think that's me finished. Next slide, Hannah. Or oh no, I get that's an explanation of this, yeah, but I think that's essentially it. Yeah, the one of the things here is that you do define this is just based on greenhouse gas protocol for ferries that you define only departing journeys only. But this is just a standardized thing based on the protocol. And yeah, so that's pretty much the process for ferries. Thanks for listening. I know that's a lot of information to kind of take in, but yeah, let me know if you have any questions at the end. I'll hand you over to Scott.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, Scott, if you'd like to carry on with your presentation now, please. Scott is the Development Officer from Carbon Neutral Islands, Cymru.
Thank you very much, Kath, and thank you, Tom. That's a good kind of oversight, really, that leads nicely into the sort of case study side that we're going to talk about here from Cymru. Next slide, please, Hannah. So as Kath says, I'm Scott Watson. I am the Community Development Officer for the Isle of Cymru for the Carbon Neutral Islands project. We're one of the initial 6 islands that were involved in the project. And as Tom highlighted in his presentation there, that's starting to expand out to other islands. What I'm going to be talking about today, although it is specific to Cymru, this applies to not just islands, but rural towns, villages, etc. It's really kind of across the board. I myself, I'm a data analyst by trade. I'm a carbon accountant, thanks to some of the training that we've done on the project. Domestic energy and retrofit assessor, and just recently an infrared thermographer as well. Next slide, please, Hannah. This is Cymru. We're on the west coast of Scotland, down in North Ayrshire. We only have one town on the island, a population of just shy of 1,300. The town is Millport. It's in the southern bay of the island there. So if you hear me referring to Cymru or Millport throughout it, it's practically the same place. Cymru's the island, Millport's the town, but even the locals get mixed up between the two occasionally. Next slide, please. I like to start off presentations with these. I think these are great examples of what we're trying to do, and some of the challenges that we face when dealing with small communities in particular. The first is a cartoon from the New York Times. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I'm quite happy with that. If all we get out of this is energy independence, preserving the rainforest, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, healthy children, I will sleep easily at night with that. That's fine by me. And also, if I only had 1 hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes finding the solution. Apparently that was Albert Einstein, but we're not really sure. And I think that sums up carbon auditing really well. You need to take the time to do this. As I say on the very first slide there, if you don't measure it, how do you expect to improve it? Next slide, please. We went through the carbon audit process. It was quite an extensive process for us. We looked at many different sectors, and we worked with a lot of different consultants on this as well, including Community Energy Scotland. In addition to the ones that are on the screen at the moment, we also looked at blue carbon, which is the marine side. We looked at climate change predictions and weather predictions for the islands themselves, amongst other things. Community Energy Scotland focused on energy and transport for us. And there's a couple of things I would say we learnt from this. The first is that we seem to have a bit of a fascination on consultants that begin with the letter A. I'm not entirely sure where that came from. But also the other thing that I would say we learned from this was being involved in the process is quite important. All of these consultants produced excellent work across the board in the various sectors. One thing that was quite notable working with Community Energy Scotland was we were quite hands-on in the process, which meant then when we had to present this to our local community, we were able to explain the data, back the data, and when problems were highlighted, because there always are, we were able to explain that, understand it, and even take it back to CES where necessary. So I think that's quite an important lesson that we learned from this was, albeit you don't need to be involved every single minute of the day, being involved throughout the process was quite important. Next slide, please. We're going to focus just on energy and transport. As you saw from the previous slide, energy and transport were the two biggest areas for us as an island. Energy is the biggest. It's primarily down to residential. That kind of focused our initial efforts on what we were looking at and how we were speaking to the local community. As part of the audit, as Tom suggested, it's not just looking at one area, it's quite a broad brush. Looking at different heating types, on Cumbria we have over 54% of the households have storage heaters, usually dated storage heaters, and the RTS switch off at the moment is a huge problem for us. Also with the EPC data, as you can see, we're in the sort of bottom brackets for the vast majority of our households. So this is all the sort of data that starts to come out of this and helps to shape the conversations that we then have within the community. Next slide, please. Why was it important? Why did it matter? It gave us a clear emissions baseline. We needed to understand where we were starting from. It allowed us to take data-driven decisions for the projects that we were working on. As a data analyst by trade, I'm all for that. Stronger cases for funding, huge. I mean, if you can back up any project you're doing with facts and figures, the funding just becomes so much easier, albeit it's still not easy. Community engagement tools, it has to be relatable. Climate change is too big a topic for most of us, myself included, to grasp. We need to break it down and make it relatable to people in the communities. One example, using local data will really help that. National averages or data sets are good, but when you scale them down, you run into problems. And one example on Cumbria was we ended up with 10,000 chickens, a dairy industry that doesn't exist, 2 alpacas, and 1.2 of a pig. Because we scaled down agricultural data. Now, that is not relatable. That is going to destroy all credibility if we had published that. It's just, you have to make it relatable to people, and you've got to be very careful about the data you use in that respect. People engaged more when they saw the impact on their own homes, particularly around the energy side, and opposition turned to support when the benefits were clear. We actually had a proposal for an energy project on the island that met a lot of opposition, and that was going on at the same time as the carbon audits. It was really important for us to make sure that we connected with the community on a level that they understood and they saw where the benefits were. Next slide, please. We went out to the local community as part of our Community Climate Action Plan, which Community Energy Scotland were instrumental in helping us with as well. These are the community priorities that came from that engagement process. And from the top 7 there, you'll see that 5 of them are all related to energy. Lower energy bills, warmer homes, lower fuel poverty, of which we've got quite a lot on the island, locally generated energy, and renewable energy sources. Next slide, please. We then took this along with some of the local planning decisions that had been made, and we actually contracted Community Energy Scotland to look at a more in-depth piece of work for us specific to the infrastructure and renewables that would be possible on the island. This was a huge piece of work, and I'm extremely grateful to Dara, Evelyn and Cameron, who worked on this from Community Energy Scotland, amongst others. This will lead the way to a community-owned renewable project on this island at some point. That work is already underway, and it's this study that really helped to pave the way for this. The modelling suggested that the energy import limit to the island would be reached by 2050. We only have 2 cables that bring energy onto the island. That's really important information for us to have worked out and to have modelled. We have dated infrastructure. We know our average peak demand is 1.5 to 2 megawatts. And also that community scale renewables were difficult to cost in. They needed to be big to make them work financially, but they ended up being too big for the island's needs. So we have to try and work through that and find a balance there. And importantly, as you'll see at one of the projects we'll look at just in a minute, the greatest opportunity really was in rooftop solar. This is available on our website, along with a whole load of other stuff. Please feel free to check that out later. Next slide, please, Hannah. Some of the projects that we looked at last year, mainly community solar projects with battery on community organisations. So with the bowling club, the parish church, the golf club and the chapel building. These were all funded by the CNI project itself. Millport Bowling Club also included an air source heat pump to replace a dated and at that point on its way out oil system. The impact of these installations has been huge. We've seen a big uptake in domestic solar as a result of this. The knock-on effect or the ripple effect, as we spoke about at the Community Energy Scotland conference recently, was that people were coming and asking us about how do I get this on my house? What benefit is there for me personally as a householder? And that's had a huge effect. Also, a little sort of pet project of mine is low energy lighting. Cumbria, according to the EPC data, is one of the worst performing places in Scotland when it comes to the percentage of low energy lighting in our houses. I am trying to change that, and we give away free LED lighting to people. It's a cheap way of doing it, and it has a huge impact, not only on energy bills, but on the resulting carbon footprint as well. We've also been given out energy monitors. The reasoning for this is smart meters, as I'm sure you're all aware, in rural areas is extremely challenging. And albeit this is not an alternative, it does help just give the household a little bit more information on their energy use. Next slide, please, Hannah. The Millport 130 project, this is a solar PV and battery project for a housing scheme on the island, up to 130 houses. Solar PV and battery on each. It should be just under 100 tonnes of CO2 a year once it's in place at current rates. Also, we're looking at about 790 to 800 pounds per household in energy savings based on sort of typical usage. That's a direct benefit to the household. It's putting less strain on the local energy grid, and also we're using rooftops, not land. That was a lot of the opposition that came out of the proposal for the renewables project on the island previously. So we were listening to the local community and making sure that we answered some of those criticisms and some of that opposition. This is a big project. We're already in the pilot phase with 15 of the properties, and we're waiting on a funding decision for a further 50 on top of that. But this will be probably about 3 or 4 years worth of a project. Next slide, please. How is it all being funded? Well, as I mentioned, we do get funding as being part of the Carbon Neutral Islands project, but we've managed to tie in a lot of the other funding that's out there, such as Eco4 Flex for home energy efficiency. Green Home Systems and Cunningham Housing have been doing a lot of work for that for North Ayrshire Council. The area-based scheme, similar sort of project, and again, North Ayrshire Council have appointed partners for that. These are the 2 companies that we work with mainly on the island, and I can't stress enough how important it is to build those relationships with these companies when they're working in an area such as Cumbria or a small community. It makes a big difference if the community recognise the names and that they feel that they can trust these companies because there's so many of them out there today. Also, GBIS, the Great British Insulation Scheme, has been really popular. And up until the middle of last year, the Grant and Loan Scheme was doing a lot of work with those that already had air source heat pumps, but were looking for solar and battery. We worked with Sniffer and Adaptation Scotland. Energy Redress, we're going to as part of the Millport 130 project. ARIA funding is quite specific to Ayrshire with regards to working with a lot of the businesses in particular and helping them. And then we've also got the Islands Pit Stop funding, which is to do with the public toilets. Next slide, please. Just some of the results that we've seen to date. This is just about to get updated as we do our progress report in the very near future. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely huge what we've managed to achieve in such a short space of time. Working with partners like Community Energy Scotland, with the various consultants, has undoubtedly helped us to speed that process up. But a lot of work has gone into this. 327,000 in capital, and then that's primarily through the CNI project. But then we've also seen about 285 in home energy efficiency measures installed through the likes of Eco4, Flex, and ABS, and a 330% increase in the amount of solar since I came into post in January 2023. Can't take credit for all of that, but a huge amount of that has been as a result of the work that we've been doing. Next slide, please, Hannah. Very quickly then, just to finish up, what's next? We're going to be looking at phases 2 and 3 of the solar project on the domestic houses. We've got the public toilets, one of which is going to be completely off-grid. That will be done by the end of March. Continue to help deliver the Eco4 and ABS and GBIS funding streams. We'll look at more community buildings. We've got a community energy project feasibility study, shared roofs, and the RTS switch off is we could probably do an hour just talking about that. But that is a huge part of the work that we're doing on the island due to it being so prominent with the storage heaters. There's other things on there as well, which you're more than happy to talk to me about at another time if you like. Next slide, please. Thank you very much to Community Energy Scotland, in particular to Kath and to Hannah for pulling all this together and inviting me to be part of it. If you'd like to reach out to me at any point, then please feel free to do so. And I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Tom and Scott. Sorry, Kath. We're just going to move forward into the Q&A. So I saw that Alex had his hand up earlier. Alex, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, why not? Sorry about that. I have a question for you, Tom. When you explained a bit more about obviously carbon offset, and you mentioned something which yeah, I don't know. I did a course about carbon footprint and was mainly focused on scope 3. And we've been told that sometimes it's good to sometimes, although you report, even if you report more, that is fine. And you said something that you have to be quite specific about what you report. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you how will you see that? Because yeah, what we've been told is like, although if you report a little bit more, then actually what is emitted, that's not a big deal. But you mentioned that we have to be precise.
I think what I was kind of referring to there was you need to make sure that you are putting kind of the emissions in the correct scopes, and that I mean, although I think the main thing is that you want to be reporting as accurately as possible the emissions that are occurring. I think you're probably aware of this already. There is there's dependent on the data used, there is obviously a range in accuracy that you can get from the output. So it is kind of dependent on the specific situation you're talking about. But in some circumstances, I can see that and there could be like a little bit of a range to the output for a specific kind of area of it. Yeah. But yeah, accuracy is very important. That's the main thing I would say to that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think to add to that as well, and kind of what I think Tom was suggesting in the presentation, is that you can very easily direct people or sometimes even misdirect businesses and various organisations within the community down a bit of a rabbit hole if you go too granular with the information. You can end up highlighting certain businesses. For example, a bus company could be highlighted. But also, if you go too granular, it's that whole not being able to see the wood for the trees, because they start to focus on very specific areas.
That's fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, you can put your hands up. If not, I've got a question for you, Scott. Have you tried to capture other metrics beyond carbon to demonstrate the impact of the project? As we know, carbon is super important and is a key driver. But what else has been kind of important in getting that support and demonstrating that impact?
I don't know if we could maybe call them metrics as such. I tend to find that I bore people when I start to get right into the data side and talking about metrics. But certainly, I mean, the community has to be involved in this. They have to feel as though they are benefiting from what we're doing. And whilst the sort of 2040 target that we're working to with the CNI project and being carbon neutral is what we're working to, and I fully stand behind that. One of the key drivers for this project is to make sure that the community see benefit from it. So financial has been a big driver in that respect. We focus a lot on solar, battery, that type of thing. It's not going to solve all the problems, but instantly the households or the community organisations see a benefit from that financially. That's been a big driver. But I think broad brush, it's just a case of showing people where the benefit is beyond just the carbon savings. If you look at the community priorities that came out of the community engagement we did, lowering the carbon footprint was actually fairly low down the priorities. So whilst that is the key driver of this project, it's not the key drivers for the community. So you need to understand what that is. And I would say for the vast majority of people, it's going to be financial.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned fuel poverty as well, which is something that was very high up on your list, and they're obviously very connected. That's great. Thank you, Scott. I think Terry, your hand was up next. Would you like to go ahead?
Get myself unmuted. Hello again, Scott. I remember you when you were even younger, wondering how you were going to get on in life, and I said, become a carbon auditor. And I'm so gratified that it's expertise. I've got a question that came up for me recently. On Mull, we're talking about building a new high school, and there's a bit of argy-bargy about where to put it. So consultants were pulled in, and they said, oh, well, the total difference between putting it in one location compared to another was over £3 million. And I'm not going to be hoodwinked by the numbers, but they itemised it, and there's a carbon cost of travel that is estimated at £221,000. How does the carbon impact of travel relate to a figure like that? Can anybody help?
That's an interesting one. So yeah, everyone heard it there. It is official. It is Terry's fault that I am involved in this. So thank you very much for that, Terry. I think what that highlights a little bit, Terry, is that albeit we have the greenhouse gas protocol and things that state, they've got lots of different rules and guidance. I think there's still an awful lot of uncertainty in how certain things are calculated and how that translates, particularly into industry. Everyone is still learning in a lot of these areas, particularly within industry, and consistency does seem to be a bit of a problem. Tom, I don't know if you've got anything else to add on that.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, I guess it's hard with just an output figure like that to understand how it's being attributed, how those emissions are being attributed, how they are. So I guess it's a bit of a challenging one to answer in itself. Yeah, but I think that's one of the things you have with this kind of thing. If you have, like Scott says, people who are maybe a bit less experienced, or yeah, kind of bringing out
So
figures they don't
there is
understand.
no mysterious
Yeah,
there's no mysterious protocol for turning tons of carbon into a financial figure. They've just got it wrong.
Not necessarily. I mean, there are figures out there that suggest how much a ton of carbon costs if you were to offset it, etc. And sometimes people will use that. The problem is, again, consistency. There's no standardized version of that at the moment. So you're relying entirely on what the company or what the individual decides to use. I'd like to hope somewhere, though, that it is documented on what their methodology was.
Thank you. I will look into it. I've asked the experts and they weren't able to help me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. It does sound like a little bit of a mystery there. I hope you get some more information on that. And we'll move over to Gordy.
Yeah, thank you. It'll be difficult to get a point across, I suppose, but I'm going through the same process in delivering a project with SSE Renewables on a community analytics, but it's kind of a defined community within an urban center. It's not really an urban center; it's a small town, but it's an area of deprivation, and we're going through trying to analyze the carbon there. But again, it's the whole thing of how you can relate the carbon. The community doesn't relate to carbon, and it's unique in the sense that 70% of the properties are owned by RSLs. So effectively, in that process of decarbonizing, the residents of those properties are not the decision makers. And so when we're trying to define the carbon impact, or it relates to decarbonization of properties that Scottish government is now is saying through the standard tool that the RSLs will have to do. And part of this is to try to make a case for this on the carbon reduction, which is the end game effectively for everybody, but the true relatable is energy pricing, and effectively to reduce the carbon in a community such as this, it comes down to replacing with air source heat pumps effectively, or not. The case for us now is to make it for a district heating system to reduce the carbon. But then you get into the kilowatt generation of electricity, and apparently it's about 185 grams per kilowatt of electricity generates. And the case study we're trying to make is to shift over to actually incinerate waste products, a part of the garbage. And the case study for that is to use the Shep case in Shetland, where their study says that it's only 55 grams per kilowatt, 55 grams of carbon per kilowatt of electricity to generate a kilowatt. So we're trying to make the case study of not to go decarbonize, but actually burn carbon. And we don't know how that's going to work out, but it's an anomaly that we have to try to work out with, in fact, so that we can justify getting effectively a free resource, which is the local garbage, which is incinerated at another location anyway. It's just it actually the carbon reduction, because they don't have to ship it to Lanarkshire, sorry, to generate it, to burn it. But yeah, so it's an anomaly around carbon accounting that we're trying to justify burning carbon to not burn carbon. I think that's kind of the point of is that going to work or not? You know, that's my point of question. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a bit of an odd one.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Not something we've come across in Cumbria. But I mean, in terms of the carbon accounting side of it, it's factual. You know, it's data. As a as somebody that's basically spent my entire life looking at data in one shape or form, you can use data to make any argument you want. The if if burning the waste is actually reducing the carbon, then that's quite a solid argument. And it's just a case of calculating that and how you present your case study. It's a difficult one to get your head around, guess, because most people wouldn't jump to that as the solution. But yeah, it's a case of working through the figures and actually proving that is what's happening. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
definitely.
waste. Sorry, waste has a big carbon footprint associated to it in various different shapes and sizes, some of which we don't even fully understand. So it's all still a work in progress.
Thanks very much, Scott. Thanks. And thanks everyone for your questions. And yeah, as Scott said, a lot of the time you've got the data and then it's about how you present it and what things you can relate it back to the community, as well as that data and what's important for the community. So just to finish up, I've got a quick survey on just some feedback. This feedback will help us build into future events. I'm just going to share my screen.